All right, so let's get started here. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I appreciate your time and attention. My name is Robert Rodriguez Jr., and on behalf of Canson Infinity, today I'll be sharing some general information with you on how to select the right paper for your image or getting it right the first time. There'll be some time at the end of the presentation for questions. So you can enter those questions in the questions area of the webinar software. And then towards the end, I'll go through those and answer as many as I can, given time and also how relevant they are. But I'll do my best to try to answer as many of your questions as possible. Now, before I get started, I just want to say that talking about paper specifically in online in a webinar is rather difficult because we're obviously talking about something that is physical, that's tactile, and so it's hard to really convey a sense of that unless you're actually holding the prints in your hands. But I'm going to do my best using language and so forth to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, and hopefully that helps you to get a better sense of the concepts, the ideas, and informs you in terms of what we're talking about here, which is trying to select and trying to pick the right paper that is going to best complement your photograph or your image. So I have two goals in this presentation. The first is to illustrate why paper is important, selecting the best paper is important, and why it can actually lead to better prints that support your vision and your style. And the second goal is to give you some basic principles that you can start to use in your approach to selecting the best papers for your images. Now, these are general principles. It doesn't mean they apply in every situation, and they're not rules necessarily, but they're principles that will work most of the time, and then they're going to guide you towards having a better understanding of the concepts and the decisions that you're making. The other thing that's important is that choosing the best paper is something that takes practice. It's not something that you learn overnight. So the title of this webinar is a kind of a misnomer in a way, getting it right the first time. That can be rather difficult and rather frustrating. I think what's most important is getting your vision of the image right the first time. That is the thing that's going to help you the most in terms of selecting the right paper. If you get your vision for the image right, if you kind of understand the why of the picture and what you're trying to convey to your viewer, to your audience, no matter who that audience is, it could be a family member or it could be an art collector, it doesn't matter. If you get that vision right, then selecting the paper becomes, I would say, easier. It becomes a little more informed, if you will. If you learn the concepts that I'm going to talk about today, I think you'll become better at working with papers, and your images and your prints are going to improve. I think you'll get a better sense of how papers can complement, even define your style. And so I hope that that's what you get out of this webinar today. I've been a professional landscape photographer for over 12 years. I've also been printing my work for just as long, and prints have always been a part of my creative work. To me, a print defines the end result. It's the physical manifestation of my vision and my effort and everything that I do in the field. And so it provides a sense of completion for me. And I hope that that's some of the reasons why you're attracted to printing as well. And if they aren't, that's something you can consider, how making prints kind of completes a workflow and allows you to present the final vision of what you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to convey, what you're trying to share. I've been a Canson Ambassador, a proud Canson Ambassador for almost 8 years now. That means I help with product development, I help with education, and I help other photographers and artists make choices about paper. Canson, the parent company, has been in existence for over 400 years, since 1557. And that's an incredible deep heritage of paper manufacturing that they've done over a long time for all kinds of artists, photographers, but also traditional artists as well. And so artists that have used and trusted Canson paper include Caravaggio, Degas, Matisse, Van Gogh, Picasso, Warhol, and many others. It's also important to note that Canson is a paper manufacturer. That means they make the papers from their own paper mill in southern France. And that's not the case for a lot of paper manufacturers today. When you make your own paper, it means that you have quality control at the highest level, you have consistency, and that's paramount to the Canson brand and the Canson quality, I think. So why does paper matter? Well, why paper matters goes into selecting papers, but I think it's important to know the why before the how. It always reminds me of this great quote by Mr. Ansel Adams: "The negative is the score, and the print is the performance." As I already mentioned, paper is really its own medium, and it's in the best cases it's separate from the original negative or the raw file. A lot of people, I think, make the mistake that the print should somehow duplicate exactly what you see on screen. And I think that's the wrong way to approach making prints. The print should have its own life, and that own life should be a totality of what you're trying to convey to the viewer, not just a mirror of what you have on your screen, because if that's what you want, then why put it on paper? Paper is its own unique medium, and it has its own inherent beauty and quality to it. And I think if you think of making prints this way, you'll appreciate how important paper choices are, because then the paper that you select is going to become a tangible part of your overall presentation of your vision. And choosing papers properly, it's going to be important to achieving the strongest version of your work. I'm a firm believer in trusting your eyes and your instincts over, specs, theoretical potential, analysis, all of that stuff. Your eyes should tell you whether something looks right or doesn't look right. So, for example, Dmax, a term that I'll cover later, relates to black density, how much black a paper can hold. But that's not really that interesting to me. Or I'm interested less in Dmax. I'm interested more in how the print actually looks on the paper and whether I get the feel from it that I'm looking for. And I think when we get seduced by numbers and statistics and bigger and better, it takes away from the nuance of a beautiful paper. Does your print faithfully reproduce your artistic vision, and does it convey a story, right? These are questions that I think are important to ask when you're evaluating the paper that you choose for your prints. And the answers, will tell you whether one paper is right or another paper is right. The way to truly understand how papers influence an image is to learn to trust your senses, and that's your eyes, as I mentioned before. Your intuition needs to guide you. So forget what the numbers, forget what the experts say, forget what I'm saying in terms of specs and analysis. Just use these as a guiding principle, and then look at the prints and look at your work and go from there and use that, because after all, it's your work that's going on the paper. It's your vision, and that's the thing that counts most, not comparing it to others, but what it is that you want to express. So the concept here that I'm trying to stress is the importance of having vision. This is hard to understate. It's really the basis of any meaningful print. And after teaching fine art printing for a long time, I've come to realize that the quality of the image and the quality of the vision it influences the success of a print more than anything else, more than the printer you use, the paper you use. It's the quality of the image, and that's what's important. And I can't explain how to find vision in this webinar, obviously, but I'll share how to go about choosing papers, and hopefully you can adapt these ideas to your own process. And we'll look at some prints that I've made, and also we're going to look at some prints from some of you that have submitted images, and I'll show you the images that we selected to make prints from, and hopefully that'll be useful as well. Everything I've been discussing so far rests on a specific approach to using papers, and I want to spend a few minutes on this because I think it's really important. There are kind of two approaches that you could think of when making prints. One is what I call the paper-centric approach, and that means that you look at different papers, you evaluate how they look, their characteristics, and you decide which paper is best for you, and then you make most, if not all, of your prints on that paper, on that specific paper. The other approach, the one that I prefer, the one that I use, the one that I advocate, is one that I call the image-centric approach. And that means that instead of finding one paper that works best for your images, or perhaps one paper that's good for black and white and one paper that's good for color, you evaluate each image based on what you're trying to convey to the viewer. And then you choose a paper that best complements or strengthens that vision. Now, I just want to add here that these ideas and these concepts don't only apply if you're using Canson Infinity paper. They'll apply to any paper you're using. I'm going to talk about some of the special characteristics of Canson Infinity paper, but these are just general principles that you can use. So when you adopt an image-centric approach, this allows you to be more creative, more unique with your prints, more expressive, really. And you can use the qualities of specific papers, especially a great paper like the ones that Canson Infinity makes. Now, this doesn't mean that for every image you're going to look at 8 or 10 or 12 papers and select one. That would be, that would be pretty crazy, right? For example, for me, there are some papers that generally don't complement the types of images that I make. I have a particular style, let's say, or I have a particular approach, or even just a particular vision that I'm trying to bring across. And so because there are some papers that don't work well for me over time, I've gotten to know the papers that I do really like. And I have found that their strengths complement my work most of the time. And so I have narrowed down my selection of papers to 3 or 4 papers that I generally are going to go to, but each of them brings a different quality to the print that I'm trying to make, and that allows me to tailor it to the image that I'm trying to print. Now, if you like a paper-centric approach and that works for you and you just rather keep things as simple as possible, then great. There's nothing wrong with that if you're happy with the results you're getting. But given that we have this amazing variety of papers with equally amazing printers that weren't available to generations of photographers before us, I think it's almost kind of an artistic privilege that we can consider how and why we can use these tools to express ourselves creatively. So let me talk about paper characteristics, because I think this is one of the key aspects of my presentation today. This you have to understand, because then it allows you to make these choices that I'm talking about. I'm going to break this down into some general categories that make the greatest visual difference in a print. Okay, so we've got the paper surface and the finish. Okay, we've got density, and we'll talk about density, but density is a measurement of how much black a paper can hold and convey, and the more black, that has a very visual aesthetic impact. Texture, of course, it's the sort of the roughness or smoothness on the surface of a paper, and that has a lot of implications for how we see and view a print. And then all of these things combine for just an overall look and feel. Probably the thing that non-photographers, that people who are just appreciating your work, will respond to. How does it look and feel to them? They don't get into all the details like we do, but they're going to have an impression. All of these things are determined by the 2 layers that every paper is made out of, the base and the coating. The base is what gives its paper, its physical weight and its appearance. And the base is really important because it determines the feel of the paper, especially when you hold it in your hand. So you have some papers that are made of cotton rag. You have other papers that are made of alpha cellulose, and each of those, and also a combination of those two, and each of those is going to have a different feel in hand, and it's going to create a different experience, a tactile experience, especially when you hold the prints. The finish of the paper, that's what the coating that goes on top of the base, is what really gives the paper its reflectivity, right? How shiny the paper is, its color gamut, how many colors the paper can hold, and also the amount of black that the paper can hold as well, which we term Dmax, or density. Dmax for maximum density. The greater the Dmax, the more shadow separation. If you've got lots of tonality in the shadow areas, then greater Dmax will give you a little more tonal variation. And it's important because Dmax also really defines the total contrast of a paper, how much contrast a paper can produce. And the higher the black density, the richer the shadows, the more contrast the printed image will exhibit. Now, this is important not only analytically, but it's also important aesthetically, because higher contrast not only makes a print look more aggressive, it makes it louder, it makes it more literal, more photographic, right? And this is not a good or a bad thing. This is just simply the nature of density and particular papers that have a lot of density. So louder is not necessarily better, right? You don't listen to all your music loud, and some music needs to be listened to softer, and it creates a totally different experience when we experience music, for example, at different dynamics. And the same thing with prints. You might have a print that you want to appear to be smoother, to be quieter, more softer, to convey something quiet in nature. And then density is going to work against you in that regard. Now, all of these refer again to the perception of the image and what you want to convey as a photographer, not what the subject is or what you want the viewer, but what you want the viewer to see. You know, not what the photograph is, but what you want to convey. So I want to share a few basic principles now. These are just sort of basic principles that I use every time I look at an image and I'm going to make a print and I'm trying to decide what paper would best complement my image. These are some guiding principles that I think can help you. So one, the most visible difference between papers is Dmax, or density level. Okay, and when I mean visible difference between papers, I mean when you've actually made a print. Obviously, the paper without anything on it, you won't be able to tell this. But once you've made prints, let's say you've taken the same image and printed on different papers, the thing that's going to be most visibly different between the papers is going to be density level. So that's really the first choice. The first thing that I think about when I'm selecting a paper is how much density or lack of density do I think I want for this image. The second critical component, the second critical principle is that all matte papers have a lower Dmax rating than non-matte papers. All matte papers have less density than non-matte papers. So right there, you can separate all of Canson's papers into two broad categories: matte papers and non-matte papers. And non-matte papers can be satin, luster, gloss, fiber, whatever. If they're not matte, they're going to have more density. If they are matte, they're going to have less density. And so that gives you a really important sort of fork there that you can think about when you're selecting papers. And then the final principle is that texture in the paper, in varying amounts. Some papers have no texture, and then we have degrees of texture. Texture can be used to add dimension to textures already present in an image. So by that, I mean, if you've got an image that has a lot of texture in it, you can consider using a paper with texture, because those two things will complement each other and create perhaps the illusion or even a sense of more texture in the print, and vice versa. If you've got an image that has very smooth areas, you know, a clear sky or a glass-like water, a body of water, adding texture to that may or may not be a good idea. And in general, I would say it probably isn't, because then you're going to disturb the sense of smoothness in that part of the image. Okay, so these three principles, I think, can really help you a long way towards making some generalized choices about paper that can lead you down, that can help you, you know, to feel like you're more in control and and have a better sense of what you're trying to do. So let's talk about matte papers. Matte papers, as I said, all matte papers have lower Dmax relative to other papers, such as fiber and gloss papers. They will provide you, they can have more texture than other papers. So you're going to be able to find greater amounts of texture in a matte paper than you are in a fiber or gloss or a non-matte paper. And matte papers tend to have more of a fine art look and feel. And these are things that you can think about. They tend to have a more painterly, to add a more painterly look to an image. They just look more painterly, less photographic, a little more softer, if you will. Now, contrary to what a lot of people think, Canson Infinity matte papers in particular, because I can't speak for other manufacturers' matte papers, but Canson Infinity matte papers really don't reduce the detail of an image. In fact, they hold high detail frequency extremely well. So I never, ever really worry about losing detail when I print onto a matte paper. This means you can choose papers, once again, based on aesthetic qualities and not worry about, compromising something important like detail. They're really great at capturing and preserving high frequency detail, as you can see here. This is a matte paper, and the detail is just as pronounced as I would want it to be, given this image. Now, yes, it's true that you might get slightly more perceived detail with a satin or luster paper or gloss paper, but that's not enough for me to warrant making that paper choice on detail alone. In other words, I need to want to have the greater density in a gloss paper to make the switch. Otherwise, I'm going to stick with a matte paper, and I know that the detail is going to come across well. I print finely detailed landscape images all the time on matte papers, and I just love the way those details come across. But at the same time, it allows the image, the print, to remain organic, to give me a sense of the realism and dimension that a matte paper, a great matte paper, provides. And also the lower contrast, the lower density of a matte paper as compared to other papers is one of its strengths when you need that subtlety, when you need that nuance. That old saying, less is more, applies here directly. When you're thinking about prints, that don't yell or scream at you or in your face. They lure you in with, with suggestion, with soft tones, they have a more quiet nature to them. A less photographic look to your image can, again, impart that painterly look that we're all familiar with. And it's just not it's not enough to say that you want a painterly look. The image that you are printing should already have that in it. It should suggest that sense of a softer, quieter, more painterly impression. That means you can use matte papers for any subject matter or any type of image. I mean, you can use matte papers for black and white, for HDR. It all depends on what you're looking for, the feel you want to convey. All right, and that it may seem that that seems that it might make it more difficult to select the right paper. There's no right or wrong choice. The fact is that your paper selection is going to change over time. You may have an impression about an image at one period and then change later on. Then you know that you have a choice about how to select the right paper to change the impression that you're conveying to the viewer. The next major category of papers are non-matte papers, and there are lots of different ones here, from RC, luster, satin, fiber, gloss, finished papers. All of these papers are generally characterized by having higher density, higher Dmax relative to matte paper, so they're going to hold more black. They generally tend to be smoother surfaces, all the way to silky smooth with no surface texture at all. They generally tend to be a bit whiter than matte papers. That isn't to say that Canson Infinity matte papers are warm toned or anything like that. They're not as white. And again, this is a relative thing, because if you look at a matte print, it looks perfectly white until you compare it to a gloss paper, and then you'll see that the gloss paper has a slightly higher white point. But I think that's only when you're making those kinds of comparisons. Otherwise, your eyes will calibrate and adjust to whatever print you're looking at. And these papers also tend to have more of a photographic look, a photographic feel. In fact, some of the papers have been created to emulate darkroom prints from the film days. There are different amounts of reflectivity, right? What we call satin, luster, gloss. And again, the critical visual difference is that the level of density is going to be higher on these papers. They can hold more density, more black. So that makes some great choices when you want, when you need high contrast, maximum detail, because you're getting that contrast. You want a more photographic look. they're louder, if you will. Again, to come back to that music analogy. Tonal separation in the shadows is one of the key strengths of, let's say papers like Platine, Fiber Rag, or Baryta Photographique or Prestige. And I usually select one of these papers when my shadows are a major compositional element of an image, when I need to really preserve the detail and the tonal variation in the shadows. Platine and Baryta and Baryta Prestige are part of a category called fiber papers. And these are the ones I mentioned before that have been designed to emulate the look and feel of traditional darkroom prints. They have a really smooth, silky finish. They feel great to hold in your hand. If you get the heavier weight, I always use the 300 gram weight papers. They just feel great to hold in your hand, nice and substantial. And they just have great pop, great punch. They add that to any image. I want to spend just a minute or two talking about look and feel of a print, especially when we say a print is more or less photographic. When we say that a print is more photographic, what we mean is that it presents the image more literally, more like how we would actually see it with our own eyes in reality. In general, luster, glossy fiber papers, non-matte papers tend to make an image look more photographic. If that's what you're after, if that's what you want, if that's what you think your image needs to look and present exactly what you want, then this is something definitely worth considering when you're choosing a paper. On the other hand, matte papers, right? They exhibit a totally different look and feel to an image, and they make an image appear less literal, right? Less photographic, and so that hence the comparison to painting. I'm showing you images. These are images. These are not prints, but these are images that I would print on, the previous image I would print on a fiber paper. This image I would print on a matte paper, because already inherent in the image is this quality of a softer, more subdued, quiet, more suggestive scene. And the matte paper is going to complement that. It's going to preserve that versus fiber paper that would add more contrast than needed and change the perception of the image in my eyes, from my vision, right? So, by the way, this isn't to suggest that an image that is abstract or less literal, can't work on a fiber paper, okay? In fact, a luster paper might be ideal given the specific image. What's important is that it depends on the image itself and what you're trying to achieve, tonally, the composition, etc. So you have to consider all the factors that go into making an image successful, and then choose the paper accordingly. Maybe you have a black and white image like this one that has lots of shadows, but you aren't trying to convey. You're not. I want to convey a sense of the serenity, of the stillness of the scene. A matte paper is ideal for me here because, on the whole, the feel of the moment is what I want to express, not specific shadow detail. I don't want to make the trees jump out at you. I want you to encompass. I want you to feel the entire scene. A paper with more density is going to emphasize certain parts of that image, and that's not what I want here. I want it to remain softer, constrained even. And similarly, you might have an image that's very graphic or symbolic, and you want it to appear less, you want it to appear more photographic. But the shadows are also key. Like here, I need to preserve these dark shadow areas. Like they can't really blend into each other like they would in a matte paper, because then it's too big a part of the composition. And so a paper like Platine Fiber Rag, which is what I used for this image, is ideal because it helps to support the entire composition. And it's not just simply louder, but it helps the print work as a whole. Now, texture, right, is the irregularity of a paper surface, what we commonly refer to as the tooth of a paper, right? And the coarser the texture, the rougher it is, the more noticeable and the greater impact it'll have on the aesthetic appearance of your image. So understanding how texture interacts with an image is one of the critical decisions to determining paper choice. Texture can add dimension. It can add dimension to things like, things that already have texture in them, as I mentioned in the principle, something that already contains that in your image. So whether it's rocks, sand, maybe a pastoral landscape that has lots of high frequency detail, maybe a sky that has clouds in it. Because texture is a physical irregularity on the surface of the paper, it can blend in with similar areas in your image. And again, it adds that extra dimension that you can see. It makes a print appear more dimensional. How much texture a paper has, it kind of determines how far you want to go. Before the texture starts to dominate, or it starts to interfere, it starts to become a distraction that the viewer sees. So it's a fine balance. Less is more, as I like to say. Once you go too far, I think the texture becomes, again, a distraction. And nice thing about, once again, Canson papers is that they offer you a variety of textures. And you can go from rag photographique, which is incredibly smooth, no texture at all, to something like aquarelle, which is almost like a watercolor paper, which has a lot of texture. And again, I don't go the whole gamut of textures. I pretty much gravitate and stay within a few textures because they work best for my images. But I may have a body of work that's totally different, or you may have a style or a body of work that will be aided by a paper that has a lot of texture. So that gives you the choice to find the paper that works best for you. As a principle, as I said before, the texture should complement the image. It can bring an image to life. And, in the best case scenarios, the viewer simply sees the combination of the paper and the image as a single statement. They just see it as a print. They don't say, oh, look at all that texture, because the content of the print itself pulls them in, and they just see it as its own distinct thing. This is getting back to what I said before about the print having its own life, separate and distinct from the monitor. This image in particular looks a lot better on a textured paper because I can almost feel the sand that I photographed originally, whereas on my computer monitor, it's very flat, very shiny. It's almost an artificial representation. The print for me makes it more real, more visceral, and that's what I love about choosing papers, especially papers that have this beautiful tactile, physical texture on them. So understanding, again, the paper's characteristics and what you want to say are crucial factors here. And once you start to think of prints as an aesthetic combination of the paper and the image, okay, you'll start to have a better sense of which paper is best. And as I mentioned at the beginning, but I want to emphasize again, the only way to get better at this, better at understanding how paper will combine with an image, is to spend time using papers. You have to invest time working with papers for a little while to get to know them. If you're jumping from paper to paper or from brand or manufacturer to manufacturer, that's going to make it difficult for you to get a sense, to get to know a paper, to become familiar with a paper. And you could think of it similarly to your camera and your lenses. The more you use a system, the more comfortable you become with it, the more you know its strengths and weaknesses, and then it becomes an aid, it becomes a creative tool versus a challenge. And same thing with papers. The more I use Canson papers, it may be a different brand for you, but in my case, it's Canson. The more I use Canson papers, the more I've come to appreciate and learn what they do to an image and how they impact an image. And that, I think, is a great resource that I can count on to make sure that my prints really look as best as they can and really convey something that I'm trying to bring across. So once again, becoming familiar, investing time, limiting your choices at first. Don't start with 8, 10, 12 papers. Start with 3 or 4 and get to know those fairly well. And then you can start to really see these differences that I'm talking about. Let me show you a few examples here, just very quickly, and then we'll jump into Lightroom to show you some more examples in prints, and we'll also get to our sample images from those who uploaded. Thanks very much for that. So here's an urban architectural image, lots of detail, reflective surfaces, smooth concrete, no sky, little or no texture, to me is ideal for this image. But the first choice that I have to make, as I said before, is do I want the image to be loud or soft? Do I want higher or lower density? Because once I make that decision, then I narrow down my paper selection tremendously. And for me, for this image, I need density. I need greater blacks because the blacks are going to separate the tonal values. A lot of the tonal values are very close. They're going to give me more shadow separation. And that's a part of the composition. And so because of that, I'm going to automatically start with the notion that I need more density. And now that narrows me down to non-matte papers. And from there, I can decide whether I'd like a little texture or no texture. A fiber paper might be ideal. Once again, it gives me a slight surface interest, but nothing that's going to distract the viewer. I want the viewer to appreciate the graphic nature of the elements of the content without anything becoming a distraction. So I don't want smooth areas, the glass, the side of the building, to be compromised by texture. Okay, so first, high density. That's going to narrow me down to something like Baryta Photographique or maybe even Baryta Prestige. And then whether I want some texture or not. If I don't want any texture, Baryta is going to be the smoothest paper. A little bit of texture might be okay. In that case, I would choose something like Platine, but that's secondary to the question of how much, whether I want it to be more photographic or less photographic. And that's, again, impacted the most by density. This image is a great example of how to think about volume as a starting point. For me, this image should not be loud. This is not an image that I want to scream at you. I want it to be suggestive. I want it to be less literal, more painterly than anything else. It's, I'm standing on top of a mountain, slight breeze, the light is coming over the horizon. There's nothing about the moment for me that was loud or aggressive or aggressive. It was just a lot more serene. And so because of that, and because I know that density equates to volume, I'm going to choose a matte paper. Already at the very beginning, I'm thinking matte paper because they have less density. That's going to allow me to convey that softer sense of the image. And also the texture in a particular matte paper will really blend in with the textures that you see in the scene already. Not a lot of texture because I don't want to compromise, let's say, the background where I've got fog, but a little bit of texture up front where things are sharpest and where my center of interest is, that light hitting the mountain there. So something like printmaking rag might be ideal because it'll give me a really soft, painterly look to the image and allow the whole image to speak compositionally versus emphasizing the blacks, which is what a high density paper would do. Now here's another example, but much different than the previous one. Whereas the previous one was something that I wanted to be more painterly, this is a lot more aggressive in my mind. This is more about the feel of the rocks and the ruggedness of the landscape. And the fact that within this rugged landscape, here are these beautiful flowers that are managing to grow out of this little crack, finding water whenever they get water, right? This is more visceral. I want this to be more photographic. I want to put someone right in this spot versus maybe eliciting some imagination like I want in the previous image. And so here, I'm going to choose high density. I want more black, more density. I really want to bring I really want to maintain the shadow separation that you see there in the foreground. And I want something that's just much more dense and much more aggressive. And so I would probably choose something like Platine Fiber Rag once again, because Platine has the greater density, has great blacks, great contrast, and it's going to give me a very subdued but still visible texture to the paper that complements all of the texture that you see in the image. It'll really make those rocks just that bit more dimensional. And this is what it's all about. You want the viewer to be carried away by your work, without knowing why, basically. Okay, so let me jump into Lightroom. Let me show you a few more examples. Here's an image where Again, I probably need more density than less to really make the backlighting work. I need more black, more contrast. Uh, Even though it's a quiet image in terms of the vision, but compositionally it needs density in order to work, because the shadows define the shapes and define the lines that your eye follows through the image. And so I've printed this on platine fiber rag once again. Platine gives me greater density, more black, more contrast, but it's also got that beautiful texture. You could actually see it here if I zoom in. You can see this very subtle texture to platine that just adds a little more surface detail, and it doesn't compromise the image because I really don't have any areas that are silky smooth, let's say, like a body of water. And so the texture just gives the print more dimension. Here's another image of a forest scene with very soft light and much different than the first. This is much more about a painterly quality. It's much more about the light and the colors and the shapes. And I certainly don't want to emphasize those dark trees in front of the others. I want everything to blend in. And so a matte paper is going to preserve that quieter sense of the scene, a more lyrical sense, less photographic sense. And also, once again, texture is going to really enhance all of the fine texture that I have in the image. And so for this, I've chosen printmaking rag, which is a beautiful textured paper that has good detail, preserves all the details well, but at the same time gives me a much softer, subdued, inviting look to the image versus higher contrast, which for me and my work would make this image a little bit too aggressive based on my initial impression, my vision for the image. All right, so let's now look at our 3 contestants, or our 3 selected images. And I want to thank all of you who submitted images. They were all great images. I selected 3 images based on what I thought would be most useful to show in terms of paper selection and most educational, and also images that warranted being on a nice piece of paper and giving you a sense of the paper selection that I decided for these images. And again, hopefully that'll be instructive for you. So our first image comes from Joseph. And this is Joseph's image that he sent us. So thanks very much. I want to show you the original image. Oops, sorry about that. That's the original image that Joseph submitted. This is the image that I printed, meaning that I've done a little bit of work on it. And I just want to show you very quickly what that is. You have to think of printing a little bit differently from the way you develop your images for on screen. Now, sometimes they can be one and the same, but sometimes not. Paper is, you can think of paper like a receptacle for ink, right? And you want to fill the entire receptacle from black to white in order to get the maximum quality out of the paper. So one of the things that I've done here is to make sure that the black point and the white point are set properly. This way we're getting maximum tonality on the paper. And then the second thing that I did was I added really some very subtle but significant dodging and burning. So here is, I'm looking for the brush. I don't see it now. Well, anyhow, this is, there it is. So that's a brush that I used, an adjustment brush in Lightroom to darken those areas. Why? Because by darkening those areas, we're able to create more dimension in the image. I'm darkening areas that will allow those beautiful trees to become more dimensional and give them more depth. And that's going to come through in the print. I've also warmed up the image very, very slightly, just a tad. And I also brightened the reflection a bit, just so that it just gives us that luminosity and that beautiful sort of reflection of the colors that we see in the forest area. So those are some little adjustments that I made, but I think they do allow us to make to produce the richest, best print possible. And so when I look at this image, first thing I think about is It's very colorful, lots of colors, lots of rich tonality in terms of shadows to highlights, but the blacks, right? The density, the blacks aren't what drives the image. We don't need to see these areas in here in order to make sense of the composition. We need to see really the beautiful transition of colors here and how Joseph has captured that. I'm also thinking about making the image softer because it's a beautiful forest scene. It doesn't scream at me. It doesn't seem like it should be a loud image. It seems like it should be an image that invites me in, more of a painterly look. And the texture is going to really be complemented. The texture in the image, all those trees and the wonderful detail up here is going to be complemented by a paper that has some texture. And so, again, I think less density, matte paper, and then I think about a paper that has some texture, printmaking rag. So this is the print on printmaking rag, and you can see that the colors and the softness of the image is preserved. Now, once again, mind you, this is a photograph of a print, so it doesn't quite exactly look the way the print looks in my hands, and I've tried to adjust it as best as possible. But you can be assured that it's as subtle and as rich as the original image that I showed you, but it also has that extra sense of softness and richness, a more painterly look. And if I zoom in here, you maybe can see some of the texture. It's kind of hard to see. But in my subsequent images, you can see here how the detail is beautifully preserved, even on a matte paper, yet there's a softness to the image that I think is representative of the image itself and quite beautiful. And here's from the other side. Once again, you can see the texture is really, really nice. For your information, I've printed all of these images on a Canon Pro 1000. These are 8.5 by 11 prints. And here you can see the texture a little bit better. So it's a subtle surface texture that definitely adds some dimension and definition, but not enough to interfere with anything in the image. And in fact, everything in the image has some movement to it. Even the water seems to have a slight little breeze on it. So I think that that paper with that little bit of texture, printmaking rag, is really ideal. So thanks, Joseph, once again. Okay, next we're moving up to Fernando. And Fernando sent us this beautiful image of what I would assume is some type of parrot. And I was struck immediately by just the richness of the colors, sort of a rainbow coalition of colors there. And it just jumps right out at you because the background is blurred. Even the edges of the feathers here are blurred somewhat. And so for me, the first thing I thought about was, okay, what paper would work best for this? So one, I think this is not, I mean, you could think of it as painterly because of all the colors, but it's not painterly from the point of view of being less literal. It's very literal. It's very photographic. We see an animal. It's exactly what we want, what he wants to show. He wants to show the beautiful colors of this animal. And so we want something that's more photographic, and we really want to show richness and maximum density. Maximum density, maximum black gives us the contrast that I think is going to really make this parrot jump right out of us, just the way it jumps out of us when we see it in person, right? You see a parrot and the colors are just hard to avoid. And so that's the first thing I thought was, yes, I think I'm going to go with a fiber or non-matte paper for contrast. And then the second thing I thought of was, wow, this is a great image to print onto something like Baryta Prestige, because Baryta Prestige, one of Canson's newer papers, also provides the greatest color gamut of all of Canson's papers. Color gamut is a measurement of how much color a paper can produce. And so we've got such rich color in this image that Prestige is probably going to be the paper to allow us to print as many of those colors as possible. The one little adjustment that I made to this image was really just dodging and burning. Once again, I darkened this part of the beak here because I was afraid that this was a little too bright for me. So let me show you what that looked like originally. There's the before, and there's the after. So before, you can see that This is brighter, and to me, it sort of pulls me away from the eye of the bird, and I think this is really the key thing. So after, I just darkened this a bit just to kind of tone it down and let our eyes really gravitate towards the center of interest. That little thing there, that little adjustment, I think, makes a big difference, because especially when you print, because it'll really emphasize where the viewer's eye should go and everything else that supports that. So on to Brighter Prestige. And once again, I think this paper did a wonderful job of printing this, of preserving the color and the richness of this image. And once again, this photo that I'm showing you does not do the print justice. It really has to be experienced in person to really appreciate it. But I can assure you that all the colors are there. You can see the richness of the reds, the greens, the blues. Just a wonderful example of using a paper that preserves colors. So once again, I chose high contrast, high density to maintain the richness and the photographic sense of the subject, and then Prestige, knowing that it has a wider color gamut. That's not to say that Baryta Photographique or Platine wouldn't have worked, but I thought this would be a good time to use Prestige and its great ability to print maximum amounts of color. Here's a close-up. You can see detail is phenomenal. Here you can see a tiny bit, or I should say, here you can see the subtle texture of Prestige. It's got a very, very subtle surface texture, but nothing that is going to, I think, distract or become a distraction for this image. And you can see here a close-up. You can see the texture once again. You can see the great detail of in this area, and again, the great colors. Right. So thank you once again, Fernando, for submitting your image. Really appreciate it. Okay, last but not least, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Bartholomew, thank you for submitting your image. Yes, there are more prints here because I went in two different directions. Here is Bartholomew's original, or I should say, image that he submitted. A wonderful image here of a person and their pet, I would assume. And all I did here is, in terms of editing the image, is once again, I double checked that the white and the black points were set correctly. There wasn't enough white in the image, so I raised the white point to really bring it up to maximum for whatever paper I print this on. We want to get those whites. This image, you could say, has pure white in this area. You want to make sure that that is maximized or optimized in your histogram. Same thing with the blacks, and I just opened up the shadows a little bit. Now, here's the before. That's the original image. And on a computer monitor, that works fine, because a computer monitor, of course, is backlit. It's got lots of contrast. It's got lots of luminosity coming out of it. But a monitor, or I should say a paper, is not a monitor. A paper is a reflective surface, and it's only going to exhibit maximum contrast and maximum tones when it has full light on it. And so I made some slight adjustments just to open up the shadows a bit, you can see, and then also maximize that white point so that our paper is not lacking and we can take advantage of full tonality regardless of which paper we use. All right. So my first instinct was to use a fiber-based paper because, well, actually, let me rephrase. My first instinct was, what is the photographer trying to convey here? And yes, there are lots of rich blacks, lots of depth, lots of shadow, all of that. But I didn't get the sense that this image is loud or aggressive. In fact, it's quite the opposite of that. It's a very sort of a touching, emotional image. And there's a certain softness to it. They've got their eyes, you would assume that they both have their eyes closed. There's a certain softness to that I think is important to maintain. And so I thought, okay, maybe this will work on a matte paper, because if the matte paper gives me more sense of that, then I think I've achieved, and I'm making an assumption here. I'm assuming that I know what the photographer is trying to convey. And if I'm wrong, then that's okay. That means that the photographer, you guys, can decide for yourselves how the paper is going to convey your vision. But I had to make a choice, right? So I thought, okay, I'm going to try with the matte paper. And I went on to Rag Photographique. Rag Photographique is a paper that not only is ultra smooth, has no surface texture whatsoever, but also is a paper that really holds black well. Now, all of Canson's matte papers hold black, but because Rag Photographique is so smooth, it just makes black areas almost, it just makes them very solid and very defined without any surface texture. And this is the print, the print that I made, and I think it works incredibly well. I'm still able to preserve the contrast. You can see that the blacks are uniform and dark. Once again, I printed this on a Canon Pro 1000. I did a great job of really giving me full rich blacks. I also, by the way, printed all of these images using Canson's profiles that you can download from the website. So I'm not using my own custom profiles. These are all the generic profiles that are available to everyone, to the public. So once again, back to the image, I thought it did a great job. Here is a close-up. You can see that the matte paper just creates a softness for the texture in the image. The dog's hair here, his hair, there's just something very soft and serene and really, I think, attractive about printing this onto a matte paper. Here's another angle. So you can see that there's no loss of detail there. Now, I wasn't 100% sure, I have to admit, and I also thought that it would be instructive to show you an alternative. So I also printed it on Canson Platine. Canson Platine because I always say that, or I like to think of Canson Platine as a fiber paper that sort of wants to be a matte paper. It's got a beautiful texture, very subdued, but a nice texture. It's a cotton rag paper, so it feels great to hold, but it gives you that extra density and Dmax that a fiber paper has. And here's the same image on Platine without really any changes. Great contrast, great density, holds the blacks really well. There isn't anything to complain or to think that is lacking on Platine. Here's a close-up. You can see the very subtle texture there of Platine, which is really nice. And here's from another angle. At the end of the day, we have to make a choice. And so here you can see the two prints side by side. Both of them, technically speaking, are printed as well as I can print them. They both look great, but what is the vision? What is sort of the feel that you want to create? And if this were my image, and that's a very difficult thing to say, but again, just from my basic assumptions, I think that I prefer the matte just because of the subject matter itself and what the image makes me feel and what I see when I look at the image. I'm looking at something photographic, but at the same time, you're wondering, you're thinking, it's eliciting your imagination. What's going on here? You know, is there something? Are they happy? Are they sad? Etc. And this version over here pushes, I think, it pushes the shapes a little too much to the forefront. It pushes the graphic nature of the image too much to the forefront, and I think it's less about the graphic nature and more about inviting you in. And so for me, I think that the print on Rag Photographique is the one that I would choose. But again, this is a good example, I think, of how the paper can present different perceptions. Even if they're subtle, doesn't matter. The viewer, your viewer, only gets to see your final print, and that's the impression that they're going to take away with them. So thanks once again, Bartholomew, for sending in this image, and for everyone. Let me switch back to Keynote here. Okay, so I will look at questions here. Well, there's a few questions here that I'll try to tackle. What makes Canson better than other fine art premium papers? Well, I am not going to tell you what makes Canson better, but I'm going to tell you why I use Canson, or why I think that it's the paper that I choose. And I talked about heritage. I like the idea that Canson is a paper company that has been around for a long time, and this is their specialty. This is what they do, and they've done it for a long time. And that heritage makes me feel like I'm using materials from a manufacturer that understands quality and understands what artists need. Another key reason that I like Canson, which I didn't really mention in the presentation, there's obviously lots of information that I can share, but I don't want to get you too confused, is that Canson Infinity doesn't use any OBAs. And so OBAs are optical brightening agents. They are chemicals that are added to papers to make them appear whiter. The problem with OBAs is that they fade over time, 5, 10, 15 years, and they will compromise your prints. And I prefer to use papers that don't have any OBAs, and Canson doesn't use any. Most other manufacturers do. And while you might think, well, OBAs, I'm not hanging my work in a museum or a gallery, I only need it to last 5 or 10 years. That might be, that might be good for you. For me, I make all kinds of prints, not only my fine art prints, but also prints, personal prints, prints for my family, prints for friends, prints for my kids and of my kids. And if I know that I'm using a paper that is that the manufacturer is thinking mostly about archivalness and longevity, those prints are going to last way after I'm gone, and maybe even way after my kids are gone. So that's another key thing about Canson that I really like. Let me open up this window a bit more here so I can read the full questions. Do you think it's necessary to calibrate the paper? Just want to clarify a misunderstanding here. You don't calibrate paper, you don't calibrate printers. The only thing that you need to calibrate is your monitor so that your monitor is showing you true colors. The printer and the paper don't need to be calibrated. You just make sure that you have to make sure that you use an ICC profile in the software that you're using to print. And the profile is what determines and decides what are the proper colors to send to the printer. So there's no paper or printer calibration required. I mean, outside of making sure that the printer is working properly. If your printer is having some issues, there are some calibration things that you can do with the printer. But assuming it's working fine, then you only have to calibrate your monitor. Does the glass on the print affect Dmax? Excellent question, because that's one of the things that I like to address when I have time. It depends on the type of glass that you use. Not all glass is the same. There is really good quality glass and there's poor quality glass. In general, I would say that if you're using really good glass, museum glass, anti-reflective glass, then the glass is glass is always going to have an impact on what you put behind it, but it's going to be the same for all papers. And so this idea, this notion that, well, it doesn't really matter once you put it behind glass, it all looks the same. I'm sorry, that's not true. A print that is made on a matte paper versus a print made on a fiber paper put behind glass are still going to have their relative density levels. The matte paper is still going to look softer. The fiber paper or the high density paper is going to look more contrasty. So glass just diminishes the effect of the print slightly, but it does it for all papers across the board. You can still see texture behind glass. Because that's how I make my prints. I leave a little bit of the paper showing with the matte, and you can see the texture. So I think the thing here is to make sure you use high quality glass. Can I obtain samples of the various papers so I can see and feel them? That's another good question. You can buy sample packs online. At least in the US, you can get sample packs from B&H. They sell sample packs, and I think the sample pack has 6 or 8 sheets inside. If you come to any of the photo conventions around the world that Canson is at, like Photo Plus in New York or Photokina, we give away lots of sample packs. And maybe if you have a local supplier or a local dealer, they might be able to supply you with a sample pack. But they do exist. You just have to get them in one of those ways. When would you ever, if ever, use an RC paper? Another great question. I didn't talk too much about RC papers just because there's lots of information. I don't want to overwhelm everyone. But an RC paper are also great papers. An RC paper means that the paper, RC stands for resin coated, but in fact, the entire paper is made out of a resin. And RC papers have are great papers. Canson's RC papers are great papers. There are no matte RC papers. So if you want to use a matte paper, then you can't use an RC paper. You're only going to be able to use satin or luster or gloss, those kinds of things. So you are limited that way in terms of RC papers. And also RC papers in general don't have the same aesthetic look and feel of Canson's fine art papers like Baryta Platine. I use RC papers when I'm making proofs, let's say, or when I'm making prints that are not of that I don't need the highest quality. I'm making prints that for my kids' project school, things like that. And so there's nothing wrong with RC papers. They certainly provide a great alternative, which is a little more economical. And so I think they are a great in terms of giving you something that's a little less critical. But if you want to create the thing that really gives the impression of a finely crafted print, then you want to use one of Canson's fine art papers. How does the choice of, well, I talked about glass already. Canson paper for dye ink printers, pigment ink printers, papers for each, etc. Sure, you can use Canson papers with pigment or dye inks. It's going to depend. I mean, the ink itself is going to have its own inherent qualities, and so pigment inks are different from dye inks. Pigment inks are going to give you longer longevity for the most part than dye inks. That's the biggest difference. But you can use either one. The key is that you want to make sure you use the correct profile, because the profiles for the Canon Pro 100, for example, are going to be designed for dye inks versus the profiles for pigment inks. But I wouldn't worry about using Canson's papers in a dye-based printer. Any differences in the paper for printing large? I would say no. I have printed as big as 40 by 60. And I think that everything that I've talked about is the same. Remember that printing larger doesn't mean that the viewer is going to experience it the same way. So an 8.5 by 11 will be held in the viewer's hands when they really want to appreciate it, or if it's on the wall, they're going to stand up close to it. But if you print 40 by 60, they may get close, probably a photographer if they do, but they're going to stand further away from it. They're going to create some distance so they can take the whole picture in. And once again, the soft quality of a matte paper or the higher contrast quality of a fire paper or gloss paper is going to come through. It's going to be evident in what they're looking at. When would you use a 240 gram paper versus a 310 gram paper? In general, I usually use the heaviest weight paper that's available for any paper. And the reason for that is because, one, I just prefer the way the heavier paper feels in hand. It's more substantial. It feels heavier. It just has more weight. When others hold it and feel it, it also feels really nice. Number two, because it's heavier, it's less prone to damage or to getting kinks on the ends. When I work with it, it's just heavier. It's less of a chance of getting it creased or anything like that. Also, when I mat my prints, heavier papers are easier to work with. They have less of a chance of buckling. I've matted large prints, 20 by 30, 30 by 40, and a 310 gram paper is rarely, if ever, going to buckle, whereas a lightweight paper has a higher chance of buckling. So just again, more material just provides me with something more substantial to work with. I did talk about the archival characteristics when I talked about OBAs. That's one of the main differentiators, I think, is that Canson does not use OBAs. So that's really critical to remember. One website that you should check out is Wilhelm Research, wilhelm-research.com. Do a Google search. And Wilhelm Research is an organization that tests papers and printers for the printing industry. And they provide free reports that will tell you the longevity of papers combined with inks, and they'll tell you how long they'll last in different situations. So for example, exposed to a bare bulb with UV protection in a box, etc. And you can go ahead and compare different manufacturers to see how long they last. And I can't tell you that any of Canson's papers, like for example, rag, all of the papers, but a rag photographique, for example, in a box, protected from UV, protected from ozone. Those are the two key detriments to longevity. Is so far has been rated to last greater than 250 years without any change, and that's pretty unbelievable because it's way longer than film, the darkroom prints. And also, even if the estimates are off by 10 or 15%, well, we come down 50 years, it's still 200 years. So it's a long time. Whereas Canson, you said they are manufacturers. Yes, indeed. Canson is based out of Annonay, France, which is about an hour south of Lyon. They've been in various parts of France throughout the centuries, but that's where their paper mill is now. I showed you a picture of it before. And that's where they produced all their papers pretty much from scratch and have been doing so for a long time. Last question, which I hope I can answer. Actually, two more questions. One is, what would be the lowest PPI resolution for a fine art print? This is a tricky question. It's hard to explain in 30 seconds or so, but I would say my general guideline is that anything native resolution, meaning an image before you've interpolated or resized in Photoshop or anything like that, native resolution should not drop below 180 PPI. If it drops below 180, it means that you're trying to make too large of a print, and then I would bring my print size down. And when you bring your print size down, then your PPI is going to go up. So 180 PPI is the minimum that I would try to make a print at a given size. And last but not least, apart from the ICC profile, my Canon asked me to select the type of media, I assume is what Fernando's asking. Depending on the Canon that you're using, some Canon printers allow you to use what's called an AM1 file, and that's a file that's provided by Canson that you can add to the printer, and then the media type, the Canson media types, will be available on the Canon in the Canon driver. And so you can actually load in Rag Photographique or Brighter Prestige and select that media type. That's not for all of Canon's printers, just certain ones. For the Pro 1000, for example, you cannot load in this AM1 file. And so on Canson Infinity's website, when you look for the profile for your printer and there will be an associated media setting for the paper that you want to use. So as an example, on the Pro 1000, anytime you're printing on a matte paper, the media setting is going to be highest density fine art. That's Canon's media type. Just want to make a point here that it's very important to make sure that you use the correct media type, whether you're using Canon or an Epson printer. And the media type to use, again, is listed on Canson's website when you go to download the ICC profile. If you don't have the correct media type, then you're going to get unpredictable results and you're not going to optimize your print. Your print is not going to be optimized for the profile and the paper that you're using. So make sure that you get the media setting correct. And of course, make sure that you're using the proper profile. In other words, Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever application you're using to print from is controlling the color, not the printer. All right, so thank you very much, all of you, once again, for attending this webinar. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope that it's been helpful and useful for you. You can always check out my work at robertrodriguezjr.com. And I've also recently launched a new online printing masterclass that will show you fine art printing from A to Z. And you can find that at creativepathworkshops.com. And also make sure to check out and visit cansoninfinity.com for news and updates and that kind of thing. And so on behalf of Canson, thanks very much for attending. See you next time.